Welcome to Combat Zone 360, where we discuss everything military. Today on our show, we have a special guest, retired Army veteran, Sergeant First Class Robert Baker. Thank you for joining me today.
Hey, it was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Now, what I do is I like to start my veterans off by talking a little bit about themselves. I would like to know how your childhood was growing up, any sports you played in high school, or any clubs that you belonged to.
All righty. Well, I'm originally from New York City, particularly from the Bronx. I had gone to a high school pretty much associated with an interest in the Army. Came from a dual-parent household, dual working parent household. A lot of values instilled in me as a kid, what's right, what's wrong. Probably was a little bit of basis behind my liking of some type of organizational structure. My father used to actually have me roll my socks and my underwear, so that was probably my first introduction to the Army. But like I said, originally from the Bronx, graduated high school in 1987. My interest as a kid, avid Yankee fan. Always wanted to be a professional baseball player between fantasizing Little League, and by the time I got to high school, my fantasy was kind of like cut in half a little bit. I wasn't good enough to make the high school baseball team. I wanted to be a catcher, but I remember the guy that was trying out to be a catcher with me, and he had a much better arm than I did, and I just didn't make it past the third cut. But my interest along being in high school and the activities in high school was, but what was unique about my high school is that the only high school in the Bronx that had a junior ROTC program. And I said, wow, what is this? I said, this is pretty interesting. And it was an Air Force junior ROTC program. So I was like, okay, yeah, this looks cool. The uniforms look good. Whatever structure existed in that looks good. So I ended up joining that as a club, and it turned into a curriculum. And I didn't know too much about it. I thought it was a club, but it's actually a structured curriculum over the time that you're in high school. So I ended up joining junior ROTC. And inside that program, we had military science instructors. One was a Vietnam vet, was a pilot, and the other guy was a Chief Master Sergeant, retired, who had prior service Army before the Army rolled over, or before the Army Air Corps rolled over into the Air Force. So his experience went back as far as that. So getting into that program, learning a lot about military history, learning a lot about the military in general, and not just the military itself. It's more or less along the line of a citizenship program, kind of excelled my interest in the armed forces as I was transpiring through high school. There were some additional programs that a lot of students in high school were associated with. Civil Air Patrol was one of them. And outside of high school, a lot of us were associated with the Civil Air Patrol because they had a cadet program with that as well. And that kind of began my initiation or my infatuation with military service prior to graduating from high school. So that's basically where all of that originated and started from.
Nice. Now, with your dad having that structured living, I know a lot of parents back then, 50-50. Some had that structure, some did not, kids. What did he do that he built that structure? I don't know so much anything other than wanting to teach us, me and my brother, primarily some responsibility, a right way and a wrong way. Maybe this is a more efficient way of doing things. I guess rather than just taking your underwear and socks and just putting it in the drawer, this is how you make a little bit more space. And my father used to talk a lot about his service, his time in the service. My father did 3 years, late 50s, early 60s. Okay. Did 3 years active duty, served over in Korea during that time, and then when he got out of active duty, he was a reservist for several more years after that. Well, that's where
that comes from. I mean, I guess I learned how to shine boots early. I used to shine his boots for work.
There you
and
go.
I learned how to spit shine boots way before I even started with high school thing. So nice. I had a lot of beginnings out of just knowing what a few things about the military was and the discipline involved as far as rolling socks and T-shirts and shining boots and making sure your clothes fit correctly and a whole lot of things that came from that.
So your dad was in the Army?
Yes.
Okay. You grew up within Air Force ROTC program,
Yes.
Junior ROTC, and also did Air Patrol, right?
Civil Air Patrol.
Civil Air Patrol. With you having that background within the Civil Air Patrol and Junior ROTC with the Air Force, what influenced you to go into the Army?
While I was moving through that junior and senior year, there was a lot of things that was starting to come into fruition about the Air Force, about the Army. You started, a lot of different recruiters would start talking to us at that point where we were entering our senior year. And my infatuation with the Air Force is that I wanted to be a pilot because everything associated at that age had a lot of things to do with model airplanes, and the Air Force was more glamorized along the lines of being a pilot. But then I started to learn, if you want to be a pilot, this is the course that you have to go on. And college was one of those things. I didn't have a particular interest in going to college. And although they said, hey, you can join the Air Force as enlisted, I started to gravitate more toward what would the Army be like. So my inception into the Army was a little less traditional. When I was a junior, reserve recruiter approached me about a split training reserve program. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds interesting. And what was it all about? And after I learned that after your junior year, you go to basic training, you come back to high school for your senior year, and then you go to AIT, I said, wow, that sounds appealing. That sounds interesting. I probably would have did it a little bit differently because I learned that was more associated with students that probably wanted to go to college and to be in a reserve, and be a college student. But my interest quickly changed after that AIT, after that summer AIT postgraduate.
What is AIT?
Oh, Advanced Individual Training. Okay. And I went to, my first Advanced Individual Training was Combat Medic.
Gotcha.
And I graduated from Combat Medic. I went back to my reserve unit, and I was basically sitting on my thumbs because there was no plan into college. And I knew when I was at AIT, I want to be active duty.
Yeah.
I had that love for the Army had transpired from what I was doing in high school in a junior ROTC program to, hey, I like this Army thing. I really like this Army thing a lot. And that's what I wanted to do. It basically set me off from that point. Not that I'm ungrateful with the recruiter that recruited me into that particular program.
Yeah.
It's just that if I knew how the system worked, I probably would have waited until I graduated high school and went into the active component that way instead of having to transition from the reserve to active duty because there's a process that's involved with that as well. Yeah. And I had to basically wait around about 6 months. And then company commander finally decided that, hey, you know what, you're a young guy, I got it. I'm going to go ahead and release you so you can join the active duty component, and that's how that occurred.
Yeah, now one thing I would tell these high school students is don't wait until after you graduate to join if you do want to join.
Oh, absolutely.
I would do it during your senior year.
Yes.
Yeah, because that way the Army looks towards high school students a lot more than they do towards people that have graduated.
Right.
And that will allow them to have a better chance at getting bonuses and picking exactly the job that they want because they can reach out a lot further than the graduates get to. Yes, okay. So that's one thing that I learned while I was recruiting.
Yeah.
A lot of kids would tell me, I want to wait till I graduate. I'm like, why? And then I would tell them the story. At this point, you get to reach out and look at jobs that nobody gets to see but you guys.
Absolutely.
And that means a lot more jobs are open to you if you score well on the ASVAB test.
Okay.
Yes, so that's one thing that I always told the future soldiers that I ended up enlisting into the Army.
Okay.
Now, with you spending your time in the Army, how many years did you do?
Oh, I spent 23 years in the Army.
23 years.
23 years in. My first enlistment was that I was a medic. And after that first enlistment, I started having some thought process about where I want to be, what I want to do. looking 10 years down the road at that point, because your first 4 years inside the Army is very much an introduction period. You kind of know at that point whether it's something you want to stick with or something that you'll say, hey, you know what, I came in, I did my 4 years, I want to go ahead and get out of the Army.
Agreed.
But I looked at that and said, well, what other options do I have? And I didn't have an immediate thought process. It was just one of those things, what do I contemplate here? And one of the things I wanted to do after that first 4 years is that I wanted to be a police officer. And I had a lot of thought processes about joining the NYPD after that first 4 years. But I had a reenlistment NCO who had approached me on reenlistment, and he asked me the same question. I said, okay, well, when you get out, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I think I want to be a cop. And he says, hey, let me talk to you about this military police thing. And I said, oh, okay. Well, and I saw MPs out there, and I said, well, that looks good. Them boots are shiny, and they got the nice spit shine helmets, and they get out there and they do all of these different things. And I said, well, could I continue along a military career and get into a profession that I was looking at prior to? And that's how I moved from, okay, I think I want to get out and go be a police officer in New York, to, you know what, I think I'll take this military police thing. So what I did was that I changed my military occupational specialty, and I became a MP from that point on.
That retention guy got you hook, line,
yes,
and sinker.
He sure did. He got me.
He said, let me help you finish out your Army career and do what you want.
And at that point, I considered it an investment on time.
Yes.
Because at the same time, I'm starting to build a Army career. And when you re-enlist for 4 years, it's like, okay, by the time you're done with this 4 years, now you're in the Army for 8 years.
Yeah.
And that's almost to that 10-year period. And it's like, well, do I stop now or do I keep going? But it was a very positive experience for me with re-enlisting to becoming an MP, starting to progress in the Army, getting promoted through the enlisted ranks. And I was pretty good with that. I took to that lifestyle and adopted it and said, you know what, this is it. I'm gonna make a career of the Army, and when I'm done with it, I'll be done with it when that particular point in time came.
There you go.
It was interesting.
Now, being in the Army, what places have you been to?
I can honestly say I've been to all four corners of the world. My first overseas assignment, even though a lot of people might not gravitate toward it, but the Army considered Alaska an overseas assignment.
Yes.
That's only because it's outside the continental United States. But I did my first 4 years in Alaska. Very interesting experience. I could tell you stories about sleeping in temperatures that just make your bones want to just break sitting in the chair. But Alaska was a very interesting experience. And, a lot of people, a lot of soldiers didn't realize how important our mission was in Alaska. Mm-hmm. But the Bering Strait is right there, and the former Soviet Union was not too far away. So we had a very important mission in Alaska. I had stateside assignments in Georgia, Oklahoma, Missouri. And my overseas, other than Alaska, Germany, South Korea, Iraq and Afghanistan, and a small rotation Panama. So those were the places that I was assigned while I was in the Army.
How did you enjoy South Korea?
I enjoyed South Korea. Believe it or not, it probably ranks up there as probably one of my more favorite assignments. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed the cultural diversity and learning a different culture in Korea. The food was fantastic. I won't advocate soju so much, but the food was fantastic, and you got to see a different part of the world and how it relates to being in the United States. Being that I grew up in New York City, one thing that I noticed about South Korea as compared to New York City is, man, there's a lot of cars out here on these streets and in the city, and the traffic and the hustle and bustle. Yeah. So, you grow to learn that a lot of similarities exist throughout the world. And I had a pretty good time with it. And I thought it was a very unique experience, being in a different part of the world and learning different culture.
Now, with you being in the Army, I know people have good experiences and bad experiences. I would like to go over that with you. What was your worst experience being in the Army?
You know, the worst experiences sometimes being in the Army is having to learn how to adjust to those that are appointed over you to be your leadership. Sometimes leadership can show you how to be a better leader.
Yes.
And with that, sometimes, you know, leadership that you have can make experiences less pleasant.
Yep.
My worst experience, though, in the Army per se, involved the loss of my platoon leader. I think that was the pinnacle of the worst experience I had in the Army. It was during our time that we were in Iraq, and she was leading a squad element training a specific element of the Iraqi government police forces. They were located maybe about 60, 70 miles from where we were at in Mosul, and the convoy that she was in got hit by a vehicle-borne IED.
Yeah.
And in the process, of that attack, she perished. She died.
Yeah.
And that was a very bad experience. That was probably my worst experience. At that point, I was a platoon sergeant, and it felt like not so much the whole world fell on my shoulders, but when you lose when you have your lieutenant and a platoon sergeant, it's a partnership. It's a leadership partnering that you have within the platoon, and that very much created a vacuum. And having to see how the soldiers in the platoon reacted to her dying there, it was very tough to hold in your own emotions while being the glue for the platoon. So that was very hard. That was a very hard and probably the worst experience I had while I was in the Army.
Wow. Yeah, that's tough. I actually lost a good buddy of mine while we were over there, and I know how tough it could be. But I always like to end something on a high note. What was your best experience in the Army?
I think there's a lot of best experiences. I think when you have been in the Army for a career such as you and I, sometimes you got to start racking and stacking your best experiences. So I'm not going to be elongated, but I will tell you that probably the best experiences was always getting promoted.
There you go.
When you get promoted, it's a prideful moment. You see yourself making an impact. You see yourself making a difference. And, you always told yourself from the time you was a private, when I'm a squad leader, this is the type of impact I'm going to make. When I'm a platoon sergeant, this type of impact I'm going to make. And then you finally start arriving as you get promoted and promoted and promoted. Probably not going to tell you that my best time as a leader was that as a platoon sergeant. Sometimes your best experience as a leader is being a team leader and squad leader at that lower level. Yeah. And I think the other best moment, I guess a crowning achievement when you're enlisted is when I was inducted into the Sergeant Morales Club when I was in Germany. Nice. So that was a very, very unique experience as well. So I guess I'll just sum it up to those two right there.
There you go. And going back on the leadership aspect of this, I know you were talking about how, in the military you have good leaders and you have bad leaders. Not everybody is going to be as good as the best leader that you had. And what I used to tell all of my soldiers and my subordinates underneath me is no matter what, you can learn from any leader you have. You can learn what to do from your good leaders, and you can learn what not to do from your bad leaders.
Absolutely.
And that's what I used to tell them all. I said, no matter what, it's a 3-year span. They're going to come and go. Your leadership is going to change here and there, but you can always learn from them. Have it be a positive learning or a negative learning.
Yes.
And the one thing I like about the military compared to what we call it civilian sector out in the community is when you're in the civilian sector, your leadership could be there for years.
Yes.
So if you get stuck with a bad leader, you're stuck with him until either they move on or you move on. In the military, they come and go.
That's true.
You know, and that's one thing that I loved about the military is no matter what, something's going to change eventually.
Well, that's a grand scheme design that's existed in the military for years. And with different rotations of leadership and with new leadership comes new ideas. You don't get stale. You don't stick to the concept of, well, we've always done it this way. So I've always admired that after so many years, you have to pick up in PCS and you have to take your leadership skills to a different location. So when I got promoted to sergeant, I was still in Alaska. And but when it was time to PCS and go to Fort Leonard Wood, where that was my first duty as an MP, you're in a different location and you bring a different set of ideas. You bring new energy. Sometimes people feed off of that energy. Sometimes people don't feed off that energy, but it's still different. And I think that's what makes the Army a very good organization.
Yes,
because you're able to do that. And sometimes those same leaders that we talk about that were not as good probably have that opportunity to go somewhere and be mentored by somebody else.
Exactly.
And they become better than what they were. Because I think every level of leadership that I've gone through, I've always had ideas progressing into the next level. And even I, being a critic, because I like to criticize myself as well. Hey, what could you have done better as a team leader? What could you have been better as a squad leader? What not to take into your next phase? And you will have that debate in your head as you move from one level to the next level to the next level. And not just in the Army, life in general. You take that and you keep moving with it. It's like knowing at our stage that we're not going to go out and finance a car at 24% like we did when we were privates.
Exactly.
We're not going to do that no more.
No.
Experience has taught us that, hey, we're going to do things different and much more efficiently and better than we did when we were coming up in the Army.
Agreed. Now, you did 23 years in the Army.
Yes.
What influenced you or what pushed you out? Why did you retire at the time you did?
Well, when I applied for retirement, I had looked at where I was at in my career, and I was Sergeant First Class, and what they have in the Army is promotion boards. And the last promotion board that was conducted that I was physically part of or involved in, I didn't get promoted to Master Sergeant. And the way I looked at it was, when you read the trend analysis of every promotion board that occurs, you kind of get to see what the Army is looking at, what the Army is looking for. I started to see myself moving out of that band. I was over the 20-year mark. I was probably like 21, 22 years. And they were looking at, the trend analysis was promoting Sergeant First Classes that had 17 and 19 years. They had this type of job. They had this, they had that. Different things that they look at with promotion boards. So I started to look at that and say, you know what? I think it's time to start considering retirement. And not that it was a bad thing. In general, the Army looks to promote the best leaders. I mean, that is what you should be doing. And I had no heartburn with not being judged in a category where I was not getting promoted to Master Sergeant. So I looked at it and said, you know, it's probably time to move on. And I felt that being a Sergeant First Class, I thought that's a very successful career. You know, retiring as a senior NCO, you've had a very successful career. So looking at how competitive the Army is and what the Army looks for every year from trend analysis to trend analysis, I started looking at it as maybe it's time for you to retire and move on to your next career. And I had a conversation with a gentleman named Max Brown. He's a retired Sergeant Major, and he was the DES, Deputy DES at Fort Stewart at the time.
Oh, wow.
And he had said to me in a conversation, he says, look, Baker, sometimes we have to take a hard look And he says, not that you're bad, is what the realities are.
Exactly.
And that's what it basically struck a chord with me. And that's what led to my transition. And I applied for retirement, and 12 months later, I was retired.
Nice. Now, how is the retired life?
The retired life is not exactly the retired life, because what I did was that I retired from the Army, but then I started my second career in the Army Civilian Corps.
Okay.
And what that is generally known as becoming an Army civilian. There are a lot of civilians that are employed in the Army. The Army's mission depends on civilian employees to support the troops that are out there doing the wartime mission. And I just transitioned from being a soldier to an Army civilian. So I'm on to my second career, about 8 years into my second career at this point.
Nice. And what do you do with them?
I am the police chief at Fort Hamilton. Okay. My first job leaving active duty Army, I was the chief of police at Natick Soldier Systems Center up in Massachusetts, where they do a lot of Army research and development there. And I had a promotion opportunity to come to Fort Hamilton, and I applied for the job, and I've been here for almost 4 years.
There you go. There you go. And with you being in the civilian sector for the military, I know there's veterans out there that probably want to look into that sector. How would they go about doing that?
Well, how the Army hires civilians is that you go on to the USA Jobs website and you look for positions that are open. In addition to just being an Army civilian, there are a plethora of federal agencies that look to hire veterans into positions that a veteran may qualify for. So depending on your operational experience, with whatever military occupational specialty that you have, probably in combination with college education, you qualify for jobs that are being offered out there to veterans aside the Army or within the Department of Defense, other federal agencies, especially if you're interested in being FBI agent, if you're interested in doing any type of law enforcement for DEA, whether you want to work for the Federal Aviation Administration. If you have a job that you had in the military that correlates to what a civilian agency is looking for, you go to USA Jobs and you spend some time on that website and see what type of job you qualify for, and don't hesitate to push the apply button. A lot of people become apprehensive about that, but you got to be in it to win it. And if you never apply yourself or never apply for a job, you'll never know how you can actually filter in and start a government civilian career.
Nice, and that's a lot of good information. I appreciate you giving that knowledge to our viewers. So if a high school kid came up to you and asked you for advice about the Army, what would you tell him?
Well, I have provided my advice to several young people. And I tell young people all the time that you don't have to take the Army and do what I did with the Army. You don't have to make that Army career. Use the Army as a launching platform, while at the same time, I think it's very honorable to serve your country.
Yes.
At the same time being an honorable thing to serve your country, I also believe that you start to gain some advantages with gaining some veterans preferences.
Agreed. And Rob, on that, I would like to thank you for joining us.
Hey, no problem.
I would ask you back in the future so we can still, educate our viewers about the Army.
I'd love to. Thank you very
you.
much for this opportunity.
Anytime.
All righty.
And thank you for tuning in. And until next time, make sure you thank a veteran.